This flood didn't come from the sky. It came from a mountain. Near the Nepal-Tibet border, a massive collapse of ice and rock suddenly crashed into a river. And that impact sent a violent surge of water, mud and debris racing downstream. The flood moved through narrow Himalayan valleys, destroying bridges, roads, buildings, and everything caught in its path. But here's what makes this disaster even stranger. People initially believed an earthquake had triggered it. Scientists later found that the ground shaking was actually caused by the collapse itself. So how does a collapsing glacier turn into a devastating flash flood? And why did it happen so suddenly? To understand that, we need to go to the top of the Himalayas. To understand how this happened, we first need to follow the water back to where it started. The disaster began near the Nepal-Tibet border in the high Himalayas. This is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Massive mountains rise thousands of meters above the valleys. And between those mountains are narrow rivers that carry water down toward Nepal. One of them is the Koshi River. But on that day, something from high in the mountains suddenly entered the river. Ice, rock, mud, and an enormous amount of debris. The impact transformed the normally flowing river into a violent surge moving downstream. And because the valley is so narrow, there was almost nowhere for that water and debris to escape. It was forced forward, straight toward the communities below. The further the flood traveled, the more destructive it became. Roads disappeared. Bridges were destroyed. Buildings were damaged. And the river carried massive amounts of debris downstream. But this still leaves the biggest question. What exactly happened high above the river? Because the flood was only the final part of the story. The real disaster began when a huge mass of ice and rock broke away from the mountain. But what exactly broke away from the mountain? High above the river, a massive section of ice and rock suddenly collapsed. Imagine thousands of tons of frozen material sitting on a steep Himalayan slope. When that mass breaks loose, it does not simply slide gently downhill. It can accelerate rapidly, picking up more rocks, mud, ice, and water as it moves. And when this enormous mass slammed into the river, the impact displaced huge amounts of water. The river was suddenly carrying far more than it normally could. Water mixed with mud, rocks, and ice, turning the flow into something closer to a moving concrete wall. And because the river was trapped inside a narrow Himalayan valley, the energy had nowhere to go. It was pushed downstream. And everything in its path became part of the flood. But there was another terrifying clue. The collapse was so powerful that it produced ground shaking. Strong enough that people initially believed an earthquake had struck. But scientists investigating the event found something surprising. The shaking was not the cause of the disaster. It was actually a consequence of the mountain collapsing. And that changes the entire story. Because now the question becomes, what could make an enormous mass of ice and rock suddenly break away in the first place? So what made this enormous piece of ice and rock suddenly break away? Scientists are still investigating the exact trigger. But satellite images give us an important clue. A large section of the glacier had broken away high in the Himalayas and plunged roughly 1,200 meters toward the valley below. That is more than a kilometer of vertical drop. And when something that massive falls from that height, it releases an enormous amount of energy. The impact can shatter ice, break apart rock, and pull huge amounts of sediment into the river. But there was another critical part of the chain. The avalanche appears to have blocked the river with ice and debris. For a short time, water began building up behind that natural dam. And then the blockage gave way. Suddenly, all that trapped water and debris was released downstream, turning the river into a powerful flash flood. And this is why the event was so difficult to predict. There was no ordinary rainstorm warning. There was no simple river overflow. The disaster was triggered high above the valley, where almost nobody could see it happening. But scientists are now asking an even bigger question. Could a warming Himalayas be making these mountain collapses more likely? But could climate change have something to do with it? The Himalayas are warming faster than many people realize. And that matters because glaciers are not just giant blocks of ice. They are part of an entire mountain system. As temperatures rise, glaciers can shrink. Meltwater can increase. And unstable ice and rock can become more dangerous. Some glaciers can also form lakes as they melt. And when a natural wall of ice or rock fails, millions of tons of water can suddenly rush downhill. But there is an important detail. Scientists cannot simply look at this one flood and say climate change caused it. The exact trigger of this particular collapse is still being investigated. What scientists do know is that the Himalayan region is changing. And as the mountains become warmer, the risks from unstable glaciers, landslides, and sudden floods could become more serious. That means this disaster may be more than just a story about one collapsing glacier. It could be a warning about how quickly conditions in the Himalayas can change. And for the people living below these mountains, the most dangerous part is that the warning may come only minutes before the water arrives. But why did this flood become so destructive so quickly? The answer is the landscape. The Himalayas are filled with steep mountains and extremely narrow valleys. And rivers like the boat Koshi have very little room to spread out. So when a massive surge of water, ice, rock, and mud entered the river, it was forced downhill at incredible speed. And the debris made the flood even more powerful. Huge rocks could smash into bridges. Mud could bury roads. And the rushing water could carry vehicles, buildings, and anything else in its path. But there was another problem. People and infrastructure are concentrated along these valleys. Roads, bridges, power stations, and settlements all have to follow the river corridors because the mountains leave very few alternatives. So when the river suddenly becomes a wall of water and debris, there is nowhere to hide. And that is what makes Himalayan flash floods so dangerous. You don't necessarily need hours of heavy rain. A disaster can begin kilometers upstream. And by the time people downstream realize what is happening, the flood may already be there. But now we have to look at the people who were actually caught in its path. This is where the disaster becomes much more than a story about mountains and rivers. Because people were living and working directly along these river valleys. The sudden flood swept through areas near the Nepal Tibet border. Roads that connected remote communities were damaged. Bridges were destroyed. Buildings and vehicles were caught in the rushing water and debris. And because the flood arrived so suddenly, people had very little time to react. Some were working near the river. Others were traveling through the area. And some were there because this region is an important route through the Himalayas. What makes this even more frightening is how quickly a normal journey can turn into a survival situation. One moment you are driving through a mountain valley, and minutes later the road in front of you can disappear under water, mud, and rocks. Rescue teams then have to deal with another enormous challenge. The same mountains that caused the disaster also make rescue operations extremely difficult. Damaged roads, destroyed bridges, blocked valleys, and dangerous river conditions can cut entire communities off. But there was another reason this disaster attracted attention around the world. People from outside Nepal were also traveling through this region. And some of them were suddenly caught in the disaster. But then came the moment that made this disaster truly terrifying. The flood was no longer just moving through the mountains. It was carrying an enormous mixture of water, mud, rocks, and ice directly through the valleys. Bridges that had connected communities were suddenly gone. Roads were buried or washed away. And the river was no longer recognizable. What had started high in the mountains had now become a disaster stretching far downstream. And remember, there was no warning in the form of a massive rainstorm. The danger had started kilometers away. At the top of the Himalayas, a mass of ice and rock collapsed. It hit the river. The river surged. Debris was swept downstream. And the narrow valley concentrated all of that energy into one destructive flow. In a matter of minutes, a normal Himalayan river had been transformed into a violent torrent. And this is the most frightening lesson from the disaster. You don't always need a hurricane. You don't always need hours of extreme rainfall. Sometimes all it takes is one massive collapse high in the mountains. And everything downstream can change before people even know what is happening. But the biggest question is still unanswered. If the Himalayas are changing, could disasters like this become more common in the future? And that's what makes this disaster so much bigger than one flood in Nepal. The Himalayas are constantly changing. Glaciers are shrinking. Mountain slopes are becoming unstable. And rivers are carrying more sediment and debris through valleys where millions of people depend on them. But scientists still don't know exactly what triggered this particular collapse. And that's important, because understanding the exact cause could help scientists identify similar dangers before they happen again. The terrifying part is that a disaster like this can begin somewhere almost nobody is watching. High above a valley, inside a glacier, or on a remote mountain slope. And by the time the danger reaches the people below, it may already be moving far too fast to escape. The Himalayas provide water to enormous populations across Asia. But the same mountains that provide life can also unleash incredible destruction. And this flood is a reminder that nature doesn't always give us a warning. Sometimes, the warning comes after the mountain has already moved. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to Curiosity Explained, because there's always a bigger story hiding behind the things we think we understand.